Unified conferencing.
Good morning, everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started. Please make sure your microphones are on mute. We can hear somebody typing right now. Okay. Thank you. So, I can still hear someone typing. Please make sure your microphones are muted. All right, I want to welcome everybody to the Office of Emergency Preparedness Shelter Fundamentals course. My name is Susie Silverstein, and I'm going to begin with just a few logistics. First, the slides and a handout were emailed out to everybody that registered by 9 a.m. this morning. For those of you that registered after that time, we have posted them on the internal webpage. It's on the VDH Office of Emergency Preparedness page under Training. There's the slide set and a handout. For questions today, we're asking everybody to hold all their questions to the end, and if we have time, we'll get to them all. If you want to send a question during the presentation, we have an inbox set up. It's eprtraining@vdh.virginia.gov. We'll be monitoring that throughout so we can address any questions as they come in if possible. Any questions that we don't get answered, we will answer and post on an FAQ document, and when that's available, we'll send out the link for everybody to get to that. We are not doing a sign-in sheet at each site. Instead, each person has to complete a very short evaluation in Train. So go back into Train to the course, and there'll be a button that says take evaluation. It's short, 2-3 questions. Answer it, and that will verify that you participated today and make your certificate available. The certificate will also be in Train. You can go to the same course, and there'll be a button there that says certificate, or you can go into Your Learning, click on certificates, and all your certificates will be there. We have requested nursing contact hours for this. So if you have your certificate, it will document your name, the date, and the number of contact hours for today. Before we begin, I want to thank all the people that have worked very hard prior to this point, working on committees, working on policies and procedures to pull all this information together. It's not just the speakers that are presenting that did all the work. It was a lot of people. And I want to thank you up front for all the work that you did to make this possible. And then speaking of speakers, I want to thank all the presenters that we have today. We have, I'm going to briefly introduce them now so we don't take time during the presentation to do so. We have Dr. Jabari from the Office of the Commissioner. From the Office of Emergency Preparedness, we have James Moss, Bob Moskoff, and Jennifer Freeland. From the Department of Social Services, we have Kate Archie. She's the Emergency Preparedness Coordinator. We have Alan Knapp from Environmental Health, Katie Kirchen from the Office of Epidemiology, and Jeff Anderson from the Office of Human Resources. Could you please check one more time to make sure that your mics are muted? We're still hearing a lot of noise, and if we're hearing it, everybody else is hearing it. Okay, the purpose of this course, it is a high-level fundamentals course, just so we're all on the same page about sheltering. We're not going to be able to get into a lot of details. A lot of the details are going to be very specific to the event that you might be working in the shelter for. So it's going to be pretty high level, and we are going to offer certain courses that might be more specific. For example, on August 1st, we're doing one specific to nurses. So there will be other opportunities to get specific information. Okay, by the end of this course, we're hoping you will all be able to describe the roles and responsibilities of VDH staff that are working in shelters. personal preparedness steps necessary to take before working in a shelter, understand the purpose of a shelter, and know the different types of shelter deployments. So I am going to turn this over to Dr. Jabari and see if we can.
Thank you so much, Susie, and thanks to you as well for all your leadership in getting today's training up and running. This is not a new topic to public health. Many of the folks probably on the Polycom have been called to duty at some point or another to respond, but many of our other staff have not had that chance. We saw with Florence, many of our folks wound up even going to other shelters, other areas, and every shelter is different, especially in the context of emergencies that we talk about, the purpose, the duration. Is it going to have folks with medical needs? Is it going to have focus with functional needs? What is the main purpose? So this is a very broad topic, and I think our effort here is simply to bring, especially our new employees, a little bit up to speed in terms of what is expected, because it could seem a little daunting. You say, all right, we have a hurricane, we have a major flood, we've had a tornado hit an area, and now I'm being asked to leave my family, leave my loved ones. I could be the only caretaker to go respond for work reasons. What do I do? How do I go about doing what I need to do? So having worked in at least 5 different shelters and serving as medical incident commander in 2 of them, I can tell you that most folks who wind up coming and responding to these types of events, while appropriately are a little apprehensive or a little bit nervous, everybody finds it to be an extremely satisfying experience, because if the need wasn't there, we wouldn't have those shelters. If the emergency hadn't arisen, we wouldn't be calling you for help. And so many of folks do say it's not always the easiest of experiences, and there's inconveniences when you can't stay with your loved ones overnight, when you don't have your bed to sleep in, or you don't have the types of food that you would desire. But at the end of the day, a big part of what we do in public health is emergency preparedness, and it is an expectation of all of our staff in VDH to be able to respond. And so again, one of the contexts of those responses is within the shelter framework. This first slide is intended to really illustrate the fact that we don't really do anything in public health all by ourselves. Our day-to-day coordination in our communities usually involves some, if not all, of those partners that you see on the screen: schools, the healthcare facilities, law enforcement, community centers. And so the shelter response, as you'll see as we go through the presentations by DSS and some of our staff, involve many types of employees. So the health department staff are just one type of employee that comes and assists. And even within our own staff, we have folks who will focus on clerical duties, folks who focus on environmental health duties. We certainly have the clinical and the nursing, and we try to teach and train to those discipline-specific needs as well. But in an emergency response, we need to be cognizant that we're working with a whole host of different set of individuals. Many of you have seen this web picture, again, reminding us that on a day-by-day basis, we have many types of interactions, and depending on the particular emergency, depending on where the community is, how it's impacted and where exactly it is, we'll have different relationships and conversations with many of the partners around the community. I'm going to throw some terms at folks who haven't taken ICS 100. You really should. We often talk about public health being the lead for emergency support function 8. So we break down all of the various types of governmental agencies, roles, and various emergency support functions and nomenclature that's used in every state across the United States. And of course, as many folks know, sometimes we tailor and have additional ESFs as well. But wherever you go, whether you're here, I often talk about my experience in Louisiana and Maryland. When you talk about ESF 8, you're talking about the public health and medical response. And in a disaster, public health takes the lead role to be able to coordinate and to help manage the healthcare needs of the community. So you'll hear a lot about, when we look at these complex webs of community interaction, that public health, or folks here in VDH, are responsible for ESF 8. For those who go on and take on the training, you'll see that what we're talking about today in sheltering is actually a different emergency support function. That's mass care, and why we have Department of Social Services here is because they're the lead on mass care. So we follow their lead in the shelter, with regards to organization, chain of command. We are there to provide support to mass care, whether again it's a general shelter or a medical need, along the ESF 6 lines. And for those who have colleagues out in the Office of Drinking Water, that's a different ESF, ESF 3, which we really won't get to today. So I just want to throw out those two terminologies, as I'm sure some of our speakers may refer to those as we go forward. So what are we looking at? Obviously, this is a pre-staging. When we're talking about a shelter, what are we talking about? We're talking about the very basics. We're talking about cots with not a lot of private space, oftentimes reserved for the individual of need. And in many places, especially the medical context, we talk about having a caregiver, so there's a second cot very close to the individual who may need that additional care. General shelters may work differently. They may not have the cots on day one. Some of the local community shelters we had in Irene and Chesterfield County, we just wound up having gymnasium mats for the first night. Unfortunately, we only were open one night, so we really didn't wind up needing a lot of other things. We used some of our district assets. We had bought some, cots that are able to recline, so we could accommodate individuals with CHF or those who couldn't lay flat. But when we're talking about our large statewide shelters, this is kind of what you're saying, and obviously there's no one in it yet. But just to kind of give you a feel of where you're going to be working, where those people are going to be staying 24/7, just think about what that could potentially mean for the citizens, the residents that come and congregate in such large settings. So this is to begin the conversation that in an emergency response, what we're trying to do first is make sure that we preserve life. So the first 24 hours, we want to make sure we get people out of harm's way. We put them in areas such as this. It may not be the most luxurious. It may not have all the amenities, again, of their home. But the idea is to preserve life and to ensure that we are putting our residents in a safe environment. And I'm sure there'll be other conversations about how we open up shelters in the regions. I don't think we'll go to all those technical discourse today, but we'll probably have some conversations touching on those. So I'm going to pass it on to the next speaker, who's going to talk a little bit more about what is a shelter from the Department of Social Services.
Thank you. Thanks. So as Dr. Duzari mentioned, a shelter is really a life raft. It's not a cruise boat. And when we start talking about all the services that a shelter is required to offer, sometimes you can lose sight of the fact that really this is a safety issue. This is not a comfort issue. So that said, sheltering in Virginia. Sheltering in Virginia is really a three-tiered strategy, local, regional, and state. So you've all heard that disasters start locally. Well, sheltering starts locally as well. Sheltering is part of every local emergency operation plan, and most sheltering in Virginia never requires state assistance. It's something that a lot of localities will do frequently. They're used to doing it. They all have a plan for it. If sheltering needs exceed local capabilities, then resources and requests for assistance go up to the state, and the state will then assist localities to assist local sheltering that way. Regional sheltering is they're multi-jurisdictional shelters that are really taking advantage of economies of scale. Currently, there are only one or two finalized regional sheltering plans in Virginia, but it is a way that localities have figured out that instead of opening several small individual shelters, they can open a larger one that's interregional. So that's something that I think is gaining some steam, and we'll probably see some more of that. Host shelters are something that we have not used extensively in Virginia. It's something that North Carolina relies on. And it's where one jurisdiction agrees to open a shelter for another jurisdiction's impacted population. And we're looking to create a standardized agreement that really details the time frame and the reimbursement requirements, all of that, in order to make this option more acceptable in Virginia. So for state sheltering, as I mentioned, the state supports local and regional shelters at their request. And then in the case of a catastrophic incident, the state will manage shelters. This is to enhance local capabilities. It's not supplanting the responsibility. So this is really only when there's an existing or expected need that's beyond the local capacity. And the SCRs are planned to happen outside of the response or the impact area. And they use state resources. It's state planning, state facilities, state staffing. So successful sheltering requires preparedness and accountability for the people who are going to be working there. Shelter staff need to take steps to fulfill their responsibilities to themselves through training, to their family by planning for their deployment and communicating with their family what to expect, and to the shelter itself. You need to respond on time and then follow the check-in and out processes. So the shelter guidance that I'm going to be going through is what we use for the state coordinated regional shelters. This is policy that is just for us, that unless we reference code, in which case all the code requirements are applicable to the local, regional, and state. And while the state uses these policies, we strongly encourage localities to look at them and adopt them if it's appropriate. We also encourage all the localities to make sure that, that their partners and that their council review their shelter policies to make sure that they meet all requirements. So first up, with discrimination, the state code says that conduct that violates any Virginia or federal statute or regulation governing discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, national origin, sex, pregnancy, childbirth, or related medical conditions, age, marital status, or disability shall be an unlawful discriminatory practice. And this, of course, applies to sheltering as well. Executive Order Number 1 from 2018 also prohibits discrimination. Virginia Code covers liability for public and private employees and representatives engaged in emergency services activities, and it also covers people with licenses and certificates rendering aid as volunteers. So safety really is the top priority within a shelter. It's the whole purpose of the shelter's existence is safety. The SCR policy is no weapons. So pursuant to the Code of Virginia, we have the authority to ban firearms from emergency shelters, which we do for state coordinated shelters. Additionally, other non-firearm weapons listed in the Code of Virginia are also prohibited. Registered sex offenders will not be segregated from the population. And when they're identified, security staff are made aware of the sex offenders and they are instructed to heighten observation. So drugs, alcohol, and tobacco are all prohibited from the state-coordinated regional shelters. And smoking and vaping are not allowed within shelters. They're only allowed in designated areas outside of the shelters. So shelter residents are encouraged to bring their own medications and supplies. And if necessary, they'll receive assistance in administering medications or operating medical equipment. On-site providers may not have the expertise to do this, and if this is the case, the individual will need to be referred. So shelter residents that are currently being treated through an OTB may present at a shelter with a supply of their medication. And the shelter is required to handle the medication appropriately so that it's secure and available to the resident at the daily prescribed dosage time. So we recognize that everybody is attached to their devices, and as state-coordinated regional shelters, we do not prohibit use of cell phones, tablets, all of that. It can be a lifeline for people to connect with their family and a way for them to maintain some situational awareness. But we do ask that everybody, including shelter staff, be respectful of other people's privacy, not take photographs of people without their permission, and be mindful of what is on their screen or what is playing, and to keep volumes down or wear earbuds. So as you can imagine, a lot of people in shelters have a lot of stress. And stress can cause people to react in ways that are unintended, unexpected. Behavioral health representatives will assist with behavioral crisis stabilization as requested, appropriate, and available. So they're really the first line of defense in diffusing disruptive behavior and helping keep the shelter, at a calm level. So accessibility describes the ease of independent use by people with a variety of disabilities. This applies to use of products, programs, services, and facilities. And all of our shelters are required to be accessible. Access and functional needs refer to both temporary and permanent conditions where a diagnosis or a specific evaluation is not required. So some examples of access and functional needs could be individuals from different cultures, people who don't read, who have physical, sensory, behavioral, mental health disabilities. Pregnant women, even the elderly, can fall under the access and functional needs. The disability is a much more narrowly defined term, and it relies on a diagnosis and a limitation of major life activities. So the ADA protects against discrimination of people with disabilities and guarantees that they have the same opportunity as everyone else to services. So this is something that, of course, applies to our shelters. So one of the things to consider with accessibility and integration is communication. It's a key piece that I think can be overlooked, especially in Virginia, where we have so many different languages being spoken. And nonverbal communication is a requirement for some as well. So communications within and regarding the shelters and the programs have to be equally effective for all individuals, including those with access and functional needs. So individuals with service animals, medical equipment, supplies, care providers, interpreters, and family will not be separated from those. Service animals are not pets. So animals that fall under the pet definition would go to a pet shelter, but service animals are to remain with their person at all times. So it's required that for shelters, there's a process to be in place for requesting, providing, and ensuring reasonable accommodations for all the activities and services in the shelters. Functional needs support services are services that enable individuals to maintain their independence in a general population shelter And these can include things like reasonable modification to policies, durable medical equipment, consumable medical supplies, and personal assistance services. No recipient of reasonable accommodations will be charged for any supports or services necessary to make the programs and facilities accessible.
Now we'll move on to provide some of the context and history on how we arrived to this training session today. In 2015, the Virginia Department of Emergency Management conducted 13 listening sessions on sheltering and aggregated the results of these reports and assessments conducted on sheltering and mass care in the Commonwealth between 2008 and 2015. These listening sessions resulted in 242 identified specific concerns, ideas, and suggestions. Additionally, these sessions were used to discuss goals for a new statewide sheltering strategy and, at the time, potential solutions for consideration and discussion, and to solicit feedback from all involved parties. A direct result of these conversations led to efforts to rethinking and reshaping and ultimately a new approach to sheltering in the Commonwealth. Additionally, these directly led to the formation of the Virginia Mass Care Task Force, which includes VDH representatives from the district, region, and central office levels. In early 2017, the Deputy Commissioner for Community Health Services issued a project charter, initially to examine sheltering and specifically related to the agency's mass care plan and sheltering memo, which you may be recalled, that was originally issued in June of 2010 by former Deputy Commissioners for Public Health and Preparedness and Community Health Services. I think it's important to note that this team was comprised of Dr. Bissell, Dr. Bonds, Dr. Lindsay, Dr. Frank, Dr. Adekoya, Cindy Shelton, and Janine Uzel. So it was a very cross-cutting, holistic team to review sheltering aspects as it relates to the agency. The purpose of this project was to update the policy on sheltering's roles and responsibilities, develop an agency support plan for sheltering, and develop a mechanism for monitoring, tracking, and implementation of shelter plans. One of the first efforts related to this was a survey that was sent to health directors in early 2017 to help highlight and identify gaps and misconceptions of the role of public health in sheltering operations. The final deliverables of this project charter included updating the policy Sheltering Roles and Responsibilities, which was finalized in December of 2018, update and revision to the agency's Mass Care Plan for Health and Medical, which is commonly referred to as Annex H, and implementation, monitoring, and tracking mechanisms for sheltering. Then in September of 2017, the draft plan was completed. The major revisions that were included in this helped to clarify roles and responsibilities of health and medical care personnel within the shelter and provided guidance on district's responsibilities for mass care facilities. It also included updated standardized forms, which consist of a medical records form, the health and medical intake form, environmental health sheltering assessment form, and the authorization for disclosure of protected health information. This is a busy slide. I'll say that the VDH Mass Care Plan has gone through an exhaustive review and vetting process, which included local health districts, central offices and divisions, VDH regional staff, and was also vetted and reviewed by the Department of Emergency Management and the Department of Social Services. It's also important to note this was also briefed and vetted to the Health and Human Resources subpanel of the Secure and Resilient Commonwealth panel. And lastly, the Sheltering Roles and Responsibilities policy. I'm sure you're all aware of it. The primary purpose was to identify roles and responsibilities of local health districts and outline the general plan of coordination for provisions of health services and emergency mass care and sheltering operations. And the policy is applicable to emergency shelterings opening within the Commonwealth.
Moving on to the roles at the local health district, obviously this applies to the role of the local health director as the ESF8, as Dr. Jaberia already indicated, ESF8 lead in the local jurisdiction. At the state level, the commissioner is the ESF8 lead, and he is backed up in that role by the chief deputy commissioner as well. Bottom line is to make sure that staff are familiar with all their roles in sheltering. So assignment to support sheltering operations should never be a surprise to any of our employees, and they should be well prepared. You should, at the local health district level, ensure that your role in plans, not the plan itself, because that's the domain of the local emergency manager. Make sure your role in plans are correctly reflected in their plans. Make sure you develop and maintain training to support the roles that you in fact fill. Your planned elements for your plans should be congruent with the Virginia Department of Health Mass Care Plan Annex Hotel, which has already been discussed by James Moss. Include roles and responsibilities for all personnel who will be providing shelter support. Please use the shelter forms that are included in Annex Hotel in our plan for the Mass Care Plan. There may also be local forms that will be used by your local emergency managers, local social services, that they would request that you in fact employ, and if that's the case, I would suggest that you certainly become familiar with those. And ensure appropriate agreements are in place for updates and expectations as your roles evolve. Lead agency, VDH and local health districts are respectively at the state and local levels responsible for the health and medical roles in sheltering. We use the word here, coordinate public health, medical, and mental behavioral health needs. That is not just provide, coordinate. So if there is a requirement for external provision of such resources, then the expectation is that you would engage with your counterparts at the local level and coordinate the provision of those requirements. And also collaborate with the on-site shelter staff in the areas that are listed here. Work with local emergency managers has already been indicated to ensure staffing. You may typically we see 2 to 3 shifts per day, so make sure the shift assignments are understood, and identify supplies and equipment that may be required pre-event in your shelters. The health and medical provisioning of supplies for state-managed shelters is coordinated between the Office of Emergency Preparedness and others here at the VDH headquarters, together with our counterparts in the Department of Social Services. Collaborate needs with other agencies as appropriate, just as you would in local emergency operation centers. Provide shelter training and exercises for the roles that you in fact fill within the shelter organizations. I would suggest that training not be isolated just through VDH, ESF8, health and medical, but be coordinated across the board with your partners. Okay. Training and exercises. Okay. In the training and exercises, the activation plans, what actually gets you to the point of deploying related forms, both internal and local, regional and state forms used at the Annex Hotel forms that we provide in our mass care plan, and ensure that there's workforce development. You've heard the Commissioner talk about workforce development across the agency in all areas. Emergency preparedness is no different from any of the others. So ensure that the training and exercises and preparation And since we're now approaching the height of the Atlantic hurricane season, now is almost too late to make sure that you're doing that type of thing.
So alongside our VDH staff and partners, we have Medical Reserve Corps units across the state that consist of 7,500 volunteers that are both medical and support. They can augment local, regional, and state shelters and do many things throughout the year to support the Virginia Department of Health. Qualified volunteers can be deployed as requested to fill some of the roles that will be discussed next. We encourage you to train and engage volunteers to meet shelter staffing needs and include them in your plans.
Hello. The mission for environmental health staff in shelters is focused primarily around the safety of food and water supplies and general sanitation, which would include the proper disposal of all wastes and particularly human wastes. The reference documents I think have already been mentioned. I'll mention them again. The VDH Mass Care Plan for Health and Medical, and then the Sheltering Roles and Responsibilities Policy. In the shelter environment, the environmental health staff will report to the shelter manager. So that's a bit of a change for most environmental health folks. And then finally, they are not required to be on site at all times. Typically, environmental health staff may be asked to inspect shelter facilities, ensure the availability of safe, potable water, conduct food safety inspections, participate in investigation of foodborne outbreaks, and possibly provide guidance and other services related to rabies control in pet shelters. And then finally, being primarily regulatory in nature, the environmental health folks need to be acutely aware of the fact that you're not going into the shelter with the primary purpose of enforcing a set of rules and regulations. You really have to rely on the stuff that you know and your experience, use common sense, practice good judgment, and in particular, you're going to need good communication skills in order to get your ideas and your fixes, as it were, across. I've posted here a really nice reference guide. The Association of Food and Drug Officials, AFDO, publishes this emergency regulator pocket guide, and then there's a section toward the end of the guide that deals very specifically with shelters and mass feeding. And so the guidelines there are pretty simple and straightforward, and they're organized around these four areas that you see bulleted here: food sources and handling, receiving and storing food, serving food, and then food sanitation, cleaning, and taking care of general facilities. And I believe there's a link to this guide
In the handout.
In the handouts. Thank you.
The mission of the epidemiologist position is to conduct surveillance and investigation in the facility population. In terms of organizational structure, the EPI would report to the health or medical branch director. And typically, a district epidemiologist or a communicable disease nurse with knowledge of surveillance and investigation would fulfill this role. I want to emphasize that the district EPI or CD nurses would likely be involved in monitoring the affected community as a whole, so this position would be assigned as needed and would not require being on site at all times. Main areas of responsibility are listed on this slide and include developing standardized data collection tool for investigating disease reports. If there is a foodborne outbreak or outbreak of respiratory illness, we would develop a form and collect information from folks who are ill. Monitoring the health status of residents within the facility. So if there are increase in reports either upon check-in, as people are entering the facility, or as time goes on and that they've been in the facility and they develop new symptoms, we would be working to investigate and figure out what's going on. Certainly, as Alan mentioned, working with the environmental health folks on foodborne outbreaks, potentially working with DCLS to help coordinate any lab collection and testing to identify causes of illness. And then lastly, to make recommendations for prevention and control. That could include either cohorting folks, educating about infection control, post-exposure prophylaxis, etc.
All right, this is Susie again. Janine isn't able to be here this morning, so I'm just going to briefly talk about the role of the public health nurse. Their services include first aid, health assessment and screening, limited medication administration assistance, and case management. We're not going to get into any details today about any of these things because we're going to dedicate the host session on August 1st to this. So if you're interested and haven't registered yet, it's train course ID 108-6078. I am going to talk for a minute about different types of deployments. We have local, and that is where staff are going to a district or a local shelter. We have intrastate, which is deployment anywhere within the Commonwealth in sheltering operations. This could be local or state-supported shelters. And then we have interstate, and this is deployment outside of Virginia to another state through EMAC agreements. And if we do that, we would give you more details on what that means. If you need staff or we're sending staff, that whole activity is coordinated by the Office of Emergency Preparedness. If you need staff, we're going to ask you some questions. We're going to need to know what kind of staff you need and what kind of skills are needed. Is it a nurse? Is it environmental health? Is it a food inspector or a septic inspector? Is it clerical staff? We need to know how many people you need, when they're needed, dates, times, how long you need them for, the duties they're expected to perform, where they're going to report, the site name and the address, and if there's anything in specific you need them to bring, like a laptop or a PPE, we need to know that information as well. And we need that information because if we're deploying staff, we need to be able to tell them this information. We need to be able to tell them where and when to report, when they need to be there for how long, what they're going to be expected to do, what things they're going to need to bring. Working conditions are not the same as day-to-day work. So we need to make sure they know about that and any safety concerns. Who their local contact people are going to be. If there's going to be overnights required, what kind of accommodations, if we've made any arrangements. And then we're going to get into what to expect during deployment, and Jeff Anderson is going to come talk about that.
All right, so what to expect? As Susie talked about, there's kind of three different local, intrastate, and intrastate. So depending on the situation, is going to, affect the circumstances. So for the first off, you need to understand that the deployment process is a fast-moving, rapidly changing, and the details may be limited based on the circumstances of the event. Each deployment is different and requires different action and responses. So the ability to be flexible and adaptive are very imperative. You have to remember that it's austere conditions, so you could be in a disaster zone. Power could be limited to generators. There could be trees down on the way. I mean, it could be, depending on the situation. The shifts typically are going to be 12 hours, and there will be shift rotation. Lodging, again, is going to be dependent upon the situation. There's going to be communication gaps, limited internet. Documentation is critical. Working within the assigned scope, and then also self-care. So the question is, should you go? So you have to understand the nature of the request. If a nurse, but the nurse hasn't clinically practiced, then it may not be the right deployment. You have to evaluate the fit with your training and your expertise. You also have to assess the different physical requirements. If you're restricted to lift a certain, like less than 20 pounds, maybe this would not be the right deployment for you. Also know that there's going to be emotional challenges. Everyone is going to be in a high stress situation, and everyone has different personalities. So just keep that in mind as well. But remember that you're part of the team and to support each other. As far as your resources, you need to ask questions, express needs and concerns timely, and communicate successes. Getting back to the high stress and the different personalities, if conflicts do arise, we would need to report that to whoever the supervisor is. Make notes of lessons learned. And then you got to pace yourself. Take time to unwind. So for pre-deployment, and as we said earlier, this happens quickly. So we need to be sure that you have your items taken care of so you can focus on the task or the mission at hand. So you need to arrange for the care of your loved ones, your pets, ensure that your financial matters and those type of things are handled, especially if it's going to be a 1 or 2 week duration. Be sure that you clear your personal calendar, consult with your supervisor regarding coverage in your absence, and also keep up to date your emergency contact information. So professional items that are needed. Of course, you're going to need your ID badge, your VDH shirt, your professional license, driver's license, insurance card. If it is for an extended or EMAC type situation, then we're going to give you a packet of information that's going to cover and talk about reimbursement, leave, pay, safety, work comp, health insurance. A large priority of the tracking or the pay is to track time worked. For personal equipment, there's PPE, which is your personal protective equipment. Many times we'll have an idea as far as what will need to be taken with or will be provided there. Any type of medical devices, the appropriate footwear, clothing, because remember, you're not going to be in a typical environment. You're going to be working in, whether it's flooded or different conditions. So with that in mind, you'll need to prepare the type of clothing, the footwear, gloves, sanitizer, sleeping bag, and again, the VDH, the contact information for your supervisor and your business manager just in case something does happen. So personal items to consider. We have down boarding busters. So Granted, this is after or during an emergency situation, so the internet's probably not going to be working. There's probably not going to be power. If it is, it's going to be about a generator. So think of like headphones or books, that type of thing, in order to, so you can utilize your free time. As comfortable shoes, jackets, sleeping items again, your personal hygiene items, your cell phone charger, snacks, foods, because in an emergency situation, there may not be restaurants open, or the meals provided in the shelter may be all you have. So if you're going to a location, you might want to bring some things with you. And also your own personal medication. So on the OHR webpage, we have an emergency resources. This links to various things, the policies, because our compensation, also about leave, there's FLSA and compensation resources. There's also compensation regarding travel, and then general resources such as EAP, behavioral, for after you get back.
Okay, so you can see a lot of thought and work has gone into making all these plans so things go smoothly. But we all know no matter how hard we try, things don't always go as well as we expect. So we want everybody to just expect the unexpected. Know that there's constantly going to be changing. You might be rushing and hurrying up to get someplace to just sit and wait. What you might be doing or asked to do might be a little bit different than when you walked in, and we just ask everybody to be flexible, be a problem solver, because what you're trying to do might not work out so well, and really step up and just do what needs to be done sometimes. It's one of these, you just all hands on deck, you got to do what's needed to make it done, to make it sure it gets done. It's very rewarding work, but it can also be very challenging. In order to help people, you really need to make sure you take care of yourself first. So this self-care is very, very important. Take time to reduce your stress, take breaks, get good sleep, make sure you're eating well, because you can't help others if you're really not taking care of yourself. And then lastly, I just want to reiterate something that Dr. Jabari started with, is it takes all of us. It's a team to make this all happen. It's not one person, not one agency. It really takes everybody coming together to make this successful in a shelter. So now what we're going to do is, did we get any questions? So we didn't get any questions online. Rich, if you can make sure the mics are opened up, and then we can open up the floor to anybody that has questions. No questions?
Concerns,
Concerns? Comments?
experiences people want to share from sheltering?
Local.
Wonder if our mics were on.
Rich, are the mics unmuted? Okay, if there's nothing else, we'll just wrap up early. Thank you all for your participation. If you do have questions after the fact, we will be checking the inbox and can address them later. Thank you all.
Wait a minute, no, I have a question.
Okay, great.
Speak up loud, Frankie. I have a concern. When you said that sex offenders would be in shelters.
Have somebody come up closer to the mic.
Someone come up to the mic, please.
Yes, this is Frankie from Norfolk. I have a concern. You said there would be sex offenders in the shelters, and I understand everybody needs to be protected, but how do we protect our children when we can't always watch everybody?
So that's a great question, and that's a really valid concern. The parents need to be aware of and watch and monitor their children, period. And even though there may be nobody who is a convicted sex offender in your shelter, there may be somebody who's not a convicted sex offender. So you always have to assume that in a public setting, your children are in a vulnerable spot. So, you need to, be mindful that parents are aware that they need to monitor their children. And then all the staff needs to be really mindful about enforcing that rule. If they see an unintended child, to make sure that they connect the parent and the child together.
Plus, we have law enforcement in both local and the state setting as well.
Yes. So there is security at all shelters. That's part of the security there. But the responsibility really does primarily rest with the parent making sure that their child is supervised. And so yes, we don't segregate sex offenders from the population.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Make it in the middle and clear it. No, do it again.
Any other questions?
We had a big crowd there. Mention again about the
Okay,
nurse.
so don't forget, go back into train to complete the very, very short evaluation, so your certificate will be available for you. And we have posted these slides on the OEP internal webpage under training if you didn't get the email with the slides attached. Last thing is the handout is links to the documents that we referenced. So if you open that up, those are hyperlinks and will take you right there.
August the 1st again.
And then August 1st for the nursing session, be sure to register.
Thank you much.
All right, thank you very much.
Hey, Susie, this is Rich. Are you all done? Okay, I'll go ahead and disconnect everybody. Thank you.
We're all done. Thank you, Rich.
Susie.
Uh-huh.